Okay, well, welcome everyone. We are delighted that you've chosen to spend your evening with us. Thank you very much for coming to this Persuasion Community book talk. We are delighted to have all of you with us, as I said, and we're also delighted to have not one, but two special friends of Persuasion this evening, Moisés Naím and Professor Steven Pinker, to discuss Professor Pinker's latest book, Rationality. So the way we're going to do this, for those of you who have joined us before, you'll know we'll spend the first 30 minutes or so with an informal conversation between Dr. Naím and Professor Pinker. And then thereafter, we'll open the floor up for questions from the audience so that you all can get engaged in the discussion as well. I'll ask you to remain muted for the time being. And then if you want to speak, please raise your hand during the Q&A period and Dr. Naím will call on you. Dr. Naím will be moderating tonight's discussion. Dr. Naím, Moisés Naím, is a member of Persuasion's Board of Advisors, as is Professor Pinker. He's a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a best-selling author and an internationally syndicated columnist. For 14 years, he served as editor-in-chief of foreign policy, as many of you will know. He's also served as the director of the Central Bank of Venezuela, the Venezuelan Minister of Trade and Industry, and executive director of the World Bank. His books include The End of Power, Illicit, and most recently, the novel Two Spies in Caracas. Moisés, thanks very much for doing this, and over to you.
Here we go. Now you can hear me. Thank you very much, David, for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here with Steven Pinker again. We already spoke a few years back about one of his other books. He's well known, but let me just go through a brief note, a biographical note. He's the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, and the winner of many awards for his research and teaching. And his books, of course. He has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people and one of foreign policy 100 leading global thinkers. His book included The Stuff of Thought, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Blank Slate, and The Sense of Style. Very warm welcome, Professor Pinker. He now has given us Rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce, why it matters. Steve, you at the beginning of the book, you pay a lot of attention. You introduce us to the San people of the Kalahari Desert, and it's quite surprising and fascinating how you connect that to the general theme of rationality. Tell us about the San people of the Kalahari.
Yes, these are hunter-gatherers, at least they were until recently, living in one of the world's most unforgiving environments, the Kalahari Desert. I chose them because as hunter-gatherers, they give a glimpse into the lifestyle in which our species originally evolved. I am an advocate of considering human behavior, human thought, human emotion from an evolutionary perspective, but there's a kind of cartoon version of evolutionary history that sometimes brought into discussions of rationality, namely, what do you expect from a species that had to avoid becoming lunch from lions, that just chucked spears at antelopes, that survived on the savannah? Of course, we're not very bright, we're not very rational. Just think of we're cavemen out of time. And as something of an evolutionary psychologist, I've always resisted that characterization, or maybe that excuse, because hunter-gatherers are pretty cerebral. They have to be, because they depend on animals like antelopes that are a lot faster than they are. And the only way that they can survive by hunting is if they capitalize on a couple of other conspicuous human traits, namely we're naked, we're not covered with fur, and we are bipedal. We're pretty good at running marathons, long distances. And so the way they survive is by what is probably the oldest form of hunting, pursuit hunting, where they chase an animal at moderate speed until the animal collapses of heat stroke and exhaustion, which if you're covered in fur and you're in the desert, you can't sweat. That's what happens if you keep running and running and running. If you're a human, you sweat, you dump heat, and you can keep going and outlast the animal. But since the antelope or the kudu will dash out of sight as soon as he sees a human, the only way they can outlast the animal, keep pursuing it and harrowing it, is by tracking it. That is, they use the tracks as clues, data, scientific evidence, you will, to test hypotheses about what is the species of the animal, what is the sex, what is its condition, where is it likely to go next. And they do it with all of the tools of reasoning that I later discuss in the book, such as critical thinking. They know not to trust their first instinct, but to step back and think and reason as a group. They avoid the argument from authority. If some tribal elder thinks that it's a kudu, but some young upstart thinks that it's a springbok, he can challenge the elder, and the elder can't pull rank on it. He's got to come up with persuasive arguments. They command distinctions of logic. So, for example, if a honey badger has 2 toes, a porcupine has 3 toes. But if the ground is not soft enough, then even a porcupine may only leave 2 paw prints behind. So they know that if it's a honey badger, then there are 2 toe prints. But if there are 2 toe prints, it's not necessarily a honey badger. Namely, they avoid the fallacy of affirming the consequent. They know that if a track is ambiguous, if it could have come from 2 different kinds of animal, if it looks a little bit more like one animal, but the other one is much more prevalent in that environment, they'll go with the second one. That is Bayesian reasoning, reasoning according to the theorem of Thomas Bayes, and other examples. So when it comes to the irrationality that we see around us now, I say, don't blame the hunter-gatherers, don't blame our ancestors. We've always been capable of reasoning. The question is, why don't we always apply it in current circumstances?
That's fascinating. You write, the sapience of the sun makes the puzzle of human rationality acute. What is the puzzle of human rationality?
Well, how can a species that's smart enough to have developed a vaccine for COVID in less than a year believe in so much flapdoodle, so much poppycock? Why do we have conspiracy theories and fake news and medical quackery and paranormal woo-woo and post-truth rhetoric? You can't write off our species and say we're just cavemen. The cavemen were pretty smart. What is going on? How do we reconcile those 2 parts of human rationality?
So the definitions are always thorny issues, and in this case are also complicated. But one simple one that you have in the book is that rationality is the ability to use knowledge to attain goals. The ability to use knowledge to attain goals. And then if you accept that definition, then you have to struggle with the definition of knowledge. Use knowledge to attain goals. And knowledge, you say, is justified through belief.
I can't take credit for that myself. That's a pretty standard definition in philosophy.
Right. But then walk us through what it means where justified through belief is not shared by significant numbers of people.
Well, that is an acute problem and very much lies at the heart of current instances of irrationality, namely the people who, like I assume most people in this audience, who say, well, vaccines are an effective way of minimizing the risk of COVID. How do we know? Well, we have our experts that tell us that, and we believe them. And for the people who don't trust those experts, then they can find their own experts. Now, our experts are better than their experts, but of course, suitably enough for this forum, they have to persuade us. That is, the reason that we ought to trust some experts and not others is that the trustworthy ones can show their work. They can persuade us, they can point to the evidence that makes their claims credible. They can point to their track record of having solved problems in the past.
And the essence of the story is that man and women and human beings are rational. And that is the foundation of many of the social sciences. That, as you noted, there are often questions. And so how can you reconcile such a fundamental pillar of, again, social sciences, but also public policies, also medicine and so on, assume rationality. But very often we identify behavior that is not rational. Talk to us about that.
Yes, well, often the assumption of rationality can be almost circular in that if someone appears to be doing something irrational, you can always say they're pursuing a different goal than the one that you thought they were pursuing. And you can always, after the fact, dig up some goal. The reason that I think it's not, kind of totally vacuous and circular is that sometimes you really can point to the goal that people are pursuing when they appear to be irrational. For example, in all of us, we strive for acceptance within our community. We don't want to be ostracized. We're social creatures. It's a form of social death. And we might rationally pursue the goal of being accepted by our peers, maybe even being championed by our peers, and to avoid being ostracized by our peers by accepting the sacred values of our particular group. If you are in some American circles, then advocating for evolution, for example, no matter how strong the evidence, might make you a kind of pariah, a kind of traitor, a heretic, and you would suffer. And so there is a narrow sense in which it's highly rational to be a creationist in American fundamentalist communities. The thing is that what might be rational toward the goal of being accepted in your group may not be rational from the point of view of the goal of promoting our best supported understanding of the universe. And a problem, of course, in democracy is that when people don't have, since voters don't have an immediate stake in the outcome of their individual vote, which counts for very little, people can have opinions that express their values, express their loyalty to one coalition or another, but that may not necessarily be aligned with our best understanding of the truth.
Connected to that and connected to the uses of rationality for a bunch of social science and other disciplines, can rationality be learned?
Yeah, I mean, it can be improved. I mean, it's not that anyone is completely irrational and with the right education, they become completely rational. But rationality can be improved. That's one of my aspirations in writing rationality and teaching my course Rationality, that it's not easy that many courses on critical thinking have pretty depressing efficacy. That is, if you give people a test of rational thinking after they take them a course, they're not much better than before they took it. But of course, that's true of courses on just about everything. It's humbling as a teacher to actually look at studies on the efficacy of any kind of courses. But properly designed, properly motivated, properly carried out, then we can learn to avoid certain fallacies in our own thinking and to do better by availing ourselves of some of the formulas and tools that our best scientists and mathematicians have discovered.
And yet you argue that rationality seems scarce. That's one of the subparts of the subtitle, that it's not scarce, but it feels scarce. Explain.
Yeah, I chose that verb deliberately because there are many instances of irrationality, maybe rationality in pursuit of a different goal, such as acceptance within one's group, such as promotion of its image, of its claim to wisdom and nobility. So it could be perversely rational in pursuit of that goal. Also, I come to the subject from the vantage point of a cognitive psychologist who is steeped in demonstrations of human irrationality, many of them made famous by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And any psychology student can rattle them off: the availability bias, the gambler's fallacy, confirmation bias, overconfidence. And they are real, But sometimes those demonstrations of irrationality depend on presenting the problem to people in a way that just clashes with the natural way in which we understand things. There are a number of cases in which if you reframe the problem, if you pose it in more mind-friendly terms, people are not as foolish as they at first look. And so that's another reason why I say seems scarce. I don't want to short sell our capacity for rationality.
And that's another point. Can we be too rational? Can we be excessively rational? And here I want to bring the great Herbert Simon and his idea, his concept of satisficing, the notion that humans, instead of maximizing and optimizing, are just satisfying. What do you make of that?
Yes, so and Herbert Simon was a great economist. He won a Nobel Prize and a great cognitive psychologist and one of the founders of artificial intelligence. And his analysis certainly makes a vital point, which is that as long as we're not angels, as long as we are incarnate humans with with brains and sense organs, then rationality has costs as well as benefits, such as acquiring all of the data that are relevant to a decision. And we're mortal. We don't. We can't wait an infinite amount of time until we know everything. Applying rationality takes time. It takes mental energy. And those costs have to be factored into how much brain power you apply to a particular problem. So it doesn't make sense spending, say, 20 minutes on a route that will save you 10 minutes because it's 10 minutes shorter. You have to factor in the costs of actually applying rationality in the world. And Simon advocated the portmanteau verb to satisfice, that is to suffice, to satisfy, to instead of pursue.
But not completely good.
Not necessarily optimal in from God's point of view.
You are critical of some fallacies, like attacks on the origins of an argument, for example. And these seem to be in vogue these days in some quarters, but you also write that sometimes the context of a statement really is relevant to evaluating its truth. That gives a lot of weight to context, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And language, which is another thing that I study, is interpreted in context.
And of course, then that brings us to the media today and the many conversations about decontextualizing that we see. You argue, for example, that news organizations should be better about contextualizing, especially low-frequency risk events that they cover. And they have to be careful about progress when it happens and extol it, amplify it, communicate it more. How can this happen? What are the incentives? And does it require fundamental rethinking of the way the media industry is organized?
I think it does, because even though people have a cynical view of journalism, it's one of the institutions that has declined in trust. Most journalists I know are idealistic. They really believe that they are playing a role in informing the public. But there are certain practices that are just baked into the very nature of journalism that are guaranteed to misinform. And I'm not talking about journalists lie and they're the enemy of the people and that kind of cynical, paranoid view. But just because news focuses on events, and because one of the cognitive heuristics, indeed sources of fallacies, is that we use available events in memory as our way of estimating risk and probability. We see something in the news, we assume it's commonplace. And we see something in general, we base our estimates of risk and probability and danger on examples that we think of. And we all know it. Can you get COVID even if you're vaccinated? Well, gee, no one that I know who's been vaccinated has come down with it. Or, oh, my uncle, he got vaccinated and he got COVID. I mean, that's how we think. That's just human cognition. But it's in a technologically advanced society that has data, what we should be doing is going with the data, not on anecdotes. Now, a news site is an anecdote server. It's a plane crash, it's a shooting, it's a disaster, it's a man on the street, and it is almost guaranteed to give people a misimpression of reality. And we know this from public opinion polls, where people's opinions on prevalence depends critically on how much media coverage they get. And so events like school shootings, plane crashes, nuclear accidents tend to lead to impressions that our kids are in danger when they go to school, that nuclear energy is an unsafe source of power, that planes are dangerous and if you want to be safe, get in a car. All of them dead wrong. But that's what happens when your view of the world is informed by news. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, that while, of course, if there is a plane crash, it shouldn't be censored, or a school shooting, but I think there should be more of an effort to put it into statistical context. What is your chance of being killed by a terrorist or a school shooter or a police officer, as opposed to an argument over a parking space, a jealous lover, a gang war? What fraction of the annual homicides are exemplified by this gory, sensational story that we're reporting? Or an even more blatant example, and this I consider to be absolute journalistic malpractice. When vaccines for COVID were first adopted, sure enough, after a few weeks, there would be the story of Mrs. McGillicuddy in Baltimore, who was doubly vaccinated and came down with COVID anyway. Now, we knew that the efficacy of vaccines was not 100%. So if someone is vaccinated and gets COVID, that's not news. It's the opposite of news. It is simply another way of saying that the efficacy of the vaccines was not 100%, which we knew when the vaccines were introduced. However, a story like that can lead to the misimpression that breakthrough cases are common, simply because of the availability bias. And so I have repeatedly seen journalists almost oblivious to this built-in source of distortion in what they do day to day. And I think something of a counterweight or a remedy would be to present any flagrant incident in statistical context. This kind of thing only accounts for X percentage of deaths, killings, diseases, etc. And perhaps a little bit more of an emphasis not on incidents, but on trends. That just as in the sports page and the business page, every day there are tables of numbers. And no one complains. No one says, oh, you can't show the standings and the statistics in the sports page because people hate numbers. Well, the sports page kind of proves that people don't hate numbers when they're interested in a phenomenon. And likewise, I think there should be more of a kind of dashboard in the news. What way is the homicide rate going? What way are carbon emissions going? What way is violence against women going? What are our data on the trends in racism by many measures? And that kind of dashboard gives people I would think would give a better understanding of reality.
And a lot of what you said tracks closely to this outburst of identity politics that we have been seeing around. You mentioned the bias, but there's the my side bias too, right? And a disturbing piece of evidence that you cite in the book is the propensity of individuals to argue themselves into positions consonant with a group they support, identity. And even when there is no personal benefit to them to be gained, they still stick with the group and the new identity, the acquired identity. How can we combat, neutralize, diminish the my side bias?
Yeah, it's one of the great challenges in a modern democracy, because the psychologist Keith Stanovich, one of the world's experts on rationality, has an important new book called The Bias That Divides Us on the my side bias. It's one example of motivated reasoning. That is when you direct your train of thought so that it ends up in a place where you wanted it to end up, rather than letting the evidence guide you. And Stanovich shows that it's probably, of all of the 200 biases that cognitive psychologists and social psychologists have listed, it may be the most robust, the most powerful. It's unlike many of the other biases, it's independent of intelligence. It's found on the left, it's found on the right. And I think we don't really know how best to minimize it. One would be certainly to try to decouple particular positions from a flagrant identity with the left or the right, because we know from research, you present the same policy proposal, like here's a gun control measure, and you tell people, and this was proposed by the following conservative politician. If they're on the right, they say great. If they're on the left, they say it'll never work, and vice versa. If you take the same position and you attach it to a spokesperson from the opposite end of the political spectrum. So being mindful not to brand issues with a left-wing or a right-wing coloring or taint is important. It was a disaster that climate change got identified as a left-wing issue. And somehow, weirdly enough, why vaccines should be a left-right issue is, I don't even know if it could have been predicted beforehand, because there's a strong history of left-wing vaccine resistance, but that's what happened. I don't know how to avoid it. If it would have been, calling it the Trump vaccine, as Trump himself at one point declared, it would be, we'd have to, swallow our gag reflex, most of us, but maybe that was the effective way to do it. But just making people aware of it might eat into it a little bit, just that's a source of being wrong. Our prestigious news outlets and op-ed pages should be aware of it. And of course, again, I'm speaking to the converted, because the very name of this forum, Persuasion, kind of captures the opposite of the my side bias in its very name. Namely, it's a moral good. We ought to base our opinions on persuasion rather than identity or allegiance.
A fascinating point you make is about the ability to hold two belief systems at once, a reality and a mythology. You argue that the drive for universal realist belief systems is antithetical to our makeup. What makes this dissonance possible?
Yeah.
Does a reality system, when does a reality system become a mythology? When?
So here's the basis for the distinction. The puzzle that kind of consumed me, and I suspect a lot of people here, is, could anyone really believe that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring out of the basement of a pizzeria? People claim that they do, but as Hugo Mercier pointed out, and this was what kind of was a bit of an epiphany for me. He said, well, what do you mean that they believe it? Like one guy left a 1-star Google review at the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria. He said, the pizza dough was underbaked and some men were looking suspiciously at my son. Now, that's not the reaction that you would have if you really thought the kids were being raped in the basement. Like you'd call 911, you call the police. And the guy who burst in with his guns blazing, I mean, you got to give him credit. At least he took his belief seriously, which the people who left like a 1-star review did not. So the question is, what do we mean by believe? And there is a distinction that's been around in psychology for a while. I named it the reality mindset versus the mythology mindset, where the reality mindset is what you apply to your concrete physical life, to the social interactions that you deal with face to face. And there, even the kooks who endorse conspiracy theories and who believe in ghosts and spirits and crystal healing power, I mean, they still get the kids clothed and fed and off to school in time, and find their way to rallies. They're not hallucinating. They're not out of touch with reality, but they're different zones of reality. So while they might have accurate grasp of reality when it comes to their immediate surroundings, when it comes to things that don't impinge on them directly. What really happens in the White House or in the corporate headquarters or 10 Downing Street? What is the origin of the universe? Why do bad things happen to good people? These kind of cosmic questions outside the realm of immediate experience, people are often satisfied with beliefs that are uplifting, empowering, entertaining, and whether they're true or false is seen as kind of pedantic, as nitpicking. So someone who says Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring, it's not clear that they believe it in the sense that they believe that there's milk in the fridge. It's just another way of saying, boo, Hillary, of kind of expressing a moral conviction. It's saying, well, it's the kind of thing that she would be capable of. Did she do it or not? No one knows. How could you possibly know? Now, that's a mindset that I think all of us can be susceptible to. It's not the kind of mindset that we're satisfied with when it comes to, is there enough gas in the car to take me across town? And I think the reason is that we have this distinction is it's only recently that we've had the wherewithal to even answer questions like, what is the origin of disease? What was the origin of the universe? What really happened in the White House during the Nixon years, where we have historical archives, we have government data sets, we've got science, and all of these questions that used to be just matters of myth and speculation and idle entertainment. Now, we can do better. We can establish what's true or false. Those of us who are, I think children of the Enlightenment have the conviction that all of our beliefs should be in the reality zone, not the mythology zone. We really should know how the universe originated, how life originated, how the brain works, where disease comes from. But it's not a universal mindset. It's a kind of advanced Western, highly educated, highly rationalist mindset. I think it's a good mindset, but it's not a natural mindset.
So we have 143 participants in this conversation. I want to give them the opportunity to ask questions and comments. And let me start with DJ in Missouri. I'm going to call you in the order of arrival. And to raise your hand, as you know, there is a little button that you can punch, and hands I will recognize you. So let's start with a question from DJ in Missouri.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. It's I've been reading your stuff for years. I wonder if you could comment on the way language can both shape and, for the good or ill, the way we think about the way we think about rationality and the way we sort of apply logic. So I'll just give an example. Something I've been thinking about lately, which is the hard problem of consciousness. What is it like to be something? It's my contention that the word "like" is just reifying a whole series of discrete events that are happening, and memory is one of the discrete events that's happening. And so we reify all those together and say what it's like to be human, what it's like to be a bat. And so I feel like that word, what is it like to be something, actually makes the problem, it makes it more difficult to understand and actually misdirects the way to possible solutions. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that in general, the way language can impact rationality.
Yeah, well, it's the very fact that we can interrogate our choice of words and our idioms that, for me, is one more reason to believe that language and thought are not the same thing. Language is a way that we share thoughts. It can be a way in which we kind of suspend thoughts in working memory as we probe their implications. But it's not the same as thought, and it can be a way of misleading reality, or our conceptions of reality. And what the exercise that you have just invited us to do, namely think about whether we're misled by a common idiom like what is it like to, are an example that we must not be, we must not take words at face value. We have to probe deeper. And of course, the art of persuasion, to get back to the title of this forum, is choosing the words that frame a problem in a way that would be persuasive. That's kind of the bad sense of persuasion, namely kind of tricks of rhetoric. Tversky and Kahneman, some of the pioneers of reasoning, famously showed that people can violate some of the canons of rationality by flipping their choice depending on how the alternatives are framed. In particular, whether an alternative is framed as a gain or a loss, and people can make the opposite choice. If you're, according to a classic definition of rationality from John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern, if you do that, you're not rational. But we do that, and that's one of the reasons that Tversky and Kahneman point out we're not so rational. When it comes to your particular example, I tend to agree with you that in discussions in philosophy, on what's called the hard problem of consciousness, namely, not what's the difference between being conscious of something and unconscious of something, but rather, is there some irreducible subjectivity, some kind of first-person awareness that can't be reduced to neurobiology or information processing, often captured as, well, what is it like to be a bat? That is, when a bat, say, uses sonar to navigate its environment, not, well, yeah, it can find the insects, it avoids bumping into things, those kind of behavioral measures. But, if you could see the world from the bat's point of view, what would it be like? Now, there are philosophers, Dan Dennett is the most famous, who agree with you and suggest you're taking that expression, what is it like, far too seriously. It's just a way of misleading yourself into a kind of construction. Dennett calls it the Cartesian theater, that consciousness is this display, and there's some sort of you or that is witnessing it like a person in a theater looking at a screen. So it's kind of like, what is it like to be a person in that theater? But anyway, that's a bit of a long-winded answer that just affirms that words can mislead, reinforcing the idea that language and thought are not the same thing.
Thank you. Jeff Larson, please.
Hi, Stephen. I'm a social psychologist at the University of Tennessee who made the mistake of agreeing to teach our clinical and counseling PhD students about cognition and emotion. Last year, I organized it around the nature of belief and learned the extremely hard way that some students were passionately opposed to the notion of universal truth of any kind. I must admit that one of my tactical errors was asking them to read one of your chapters.
Oh.
I didn't really have any idea that people were so serious about relativism, postmodernism, and so forth. So I'm redoubling my efforts, and to preview my question, I'd like to quickly sketch out my plans for this coming semester, and I'm curious to get your thoughts about where exactly things are going to go off the rails this time. So I'm working on my own book. I'm furiously writing chapters in hopes of getting as many readings ready as I can before classes start in January, 91 days left. I hope that I can make the idea of universal truth more palatable by persuading them that there are mathematical facts. Square one. If we know nothing else, we know that 1 + 1 = 2. Like Descartes, I'll then hope to use that as a bridge to universal truths about the real world. I'll put 1 dot on the left side of the page, 2 dots on the right, in hopes of convincing them that there are more dots on the right than the left. I'll try to convince them that we have extremely good reason to doubt that the earth is flat or that the moon is made of Swiss cheese. With any luck, I'll actually get to the idea that we can actually use scientific evidence to better understand truths about the social world, which is what I thought they had signed up for anyway by joining a PhD program in psychology. So that's my plan. Where is it going to go off the rails?
I try to do that in the second chapter of the book on rationality and irrationality. Namely, why should we believe there are objective standards of rationality in the first place, including objective truth? And there are a number of lines of argument. The one that you mentioned, of they're just things that just seem so obvious that if they seem obvious to you, then that is a kind of prima facie case for the truth. There is something a little paradoxical about arguing for rationality and objectivity and truth, which is that unless you already believe in rationality and objectivity and truth, you're kind of wasting your time listening to persuasion of any kind. But that can be turned around, because if they're in the classroom, if they're listening to you, if they're reading you, they are already committed to rationality and objectivity and truth. Otherwise, they would just believe whatever the highest bidder offered to bribe them into believing. They are there to listen to reason. Otherwise, they wouldn't be have their ears cocked and their notebooks open. And if someone were to deny that there can be a rational argument, you could always turn it around and say, well, is that a rational argument? If not, I don't have to believe it. If it is, you've already committed yourself to rationality. There are no objective truths. Well, what about that statement? Is that objectively true? If they say no, well, you say, well, you just confess. You can believe it if you want. I don't have to. If they turn around and say, no, everything really is relative, you say, well, there, you just said that there's something that is universally true, namely that everything is relative. Now, that's not just a logical kind of trick or gotcha. It is kind of fundamental to what rationality is. Namely, it's something that is unlike other beliefs. It's something that you commit yourself to as soon as you show up to argue anything about anything. This is an argument, I don't take credit for it. I think it's been made by a number of philosophers. Tom Nagel in The Last Word is a particularly effective presentation of it, and I have it in chapter 2. So that's one. I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit at length, and I see Kelly Kirkland is next, and I will make sure that there's time for her question. Another is that there is it's funny that our students are steeped in relativism, probably from before they went to college, that it's sometimes presented as a morally enlightened view. Like you're not imposing Western, parochial, sometimes male, white standards on things. Those are just arbitrary conventions of one culture, and we have to be diverse and multicultural and accept the realities of other cultures. So much so that I've heard students say something like, well, it's considered unacceptable in our culture to kill someone, as if it's like eating with a fork instead of your fingers, just a social convention. I mean, that's how far the moral odor of objectivity has penetrated. But you could say, okay, if you really think that everything is just a narrative, everything is subjective, what about, what do you think about the Holocaust? Did that really happen? Did it actually take place? Were 6 million Jews really murdered? Or is it just, narrative that you can choose to believe or not? Or slavery, or Jim Crow, or climate change. Is climate change just a narrative? Is it subjectively true? And a lot of people since for better or worse, people's morality often dictates their beliefs. I don't think that should happen, but it does happen. But as a rhetorical technique, forcing people to swallow the consequences of their relativism can be effective. I'll mention a third thing just before I shut up, which is it does seem kind of arrogant to say there is objective truth, because the reaction is, who the hell are you to claim to have objective truth? But crucially, that's not the claim. The claim is that there exists objective truth. None of us can ever know when we found it. We aspire to it. We form communities that are dedicated to objective truth, like journalism, like science, like democracy, like the court system. But the fact that none of us can ever claim to have it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, nor does it mean that we shouldn't aspire to it.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
Kelly Kirkland, please. And we have like 7 questions and about 10 minutes, so I have to beg you to.
That's my fault.
Kelly Kirkland, please.
Hey, thanks for that, Stephen. That was really interesting. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. My general understanding here is that we should be using reason, rationality, evidence, and science to guide or lay the foundation for our understanding of the world. But I think I worry about the practicalities that are involved in actually getting an accurate snapshot of the evidence or of the science, especially if it's in a field that you're not familiar with. So for example, in the context of COVID, this has led to a lot of people saying that we should just trust the evidence or trust the science or trust the experts, rather than actually looking into the evidence ourselves. It isn't kind of the notion of blindly trusting the science anti-scientific in and of itself. So I guess my question is, how does a person who wants to use rationality to guide their understanding of the world actually practically make sense of all this information that we have?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think that any scientist who says, trust us, we're scientists, is not being scientific and is actually doing a disservice to scientific understanding and literacy. Science is especially, and they especially damage themselves because the scientific understanding will change. We start off in a position of ignorance about everything. As the evidence comes in, if we're doing science properly, we ought to change our mind as the evidence changes. If instead science is presented as just another priesthood, an oracle, then when scientists change their mind, as they must every now and again, it just discredits the whole enterprise as well. Why should we trust you? Last month you said masks, this month you say no masks. I may as well just follow some favorite blog on the internet, my own expert. So scientists, I think, deserve trust, but they have to continually earn it and replenish it by showing their work, at least making an effort to say, here's why we believe what we believe so far. In the case of translating scientific understanding into policy, I think there should have been much more explicit acknowledgement of what the cost-benefit trade-offs were in policy recommendations, such as, if we're wrong about masks, then the worst thing that happens is that people, are a little bit uncomfortable. If we're wrong and we say no masks, and it turns out that masks help, thousands of people could die. Or it will put a crimp on the economy if we if we have lockdowns. But if we let people mingle and it turns out that it is highly contagious, the result may have been thousands of deaths. I don't think people are too stupid to appreciate these if the spokesperson takes on the onus of explaining them clearly. And it would go a long way to not committing the fallacy of trust the scientists, trust the science, which I think only can lead to cynicism as the science itself changes, and also doesn't give people a reason to trust the scientists. They'll trust it if they feel that if they feel that science is kind of like our guys, our kind of people affiliated with our politics, not if they see them as politically antagonistic to their coalition. And that's not the way science should present itself.
Steve, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask 3 people at a time to give us their questions, and so you need to take note or something of the questions. So let me start with Craig Nocte.
Yeah, Stephen, this is Craig Kanaki. Your definition of rationality, use of knowledge to achieve ends. Now, there are intermediate ends, and you do note that rationality can be used to rank and prioritize ends. But the question is, can rationality help us select ultimate ends? Hume would say no, as you pointed out, and my impression is that you're a Humean. Aristotle would say yes. But it seems to me that if Hume is right, that rationality can't be used to select ultimate ends, that we're ultimately completely unhinged. Because take an extreme example, Hitler could have been perfectly rational in pursuit of his ends, right?
If the end is exterminating the Jewish people, then he was all too rational in how to accomplish it. Yes.
Yes. So do you think rationality can be used, can be applied to selecting ultimate ends?
I do, and in the book I extend this argument that on the one hand, Hume was no slouch, and one would be well advised not to argue against Hume. But his point was correct, but very, very narrow, as I think he himself would be the first to admit. He noted that it's not rational in that strict sense of rationality to prefer being healthy as opposed to sick, uncomfortable, comfortable as opposed to in pain, hungry as opposed to well-fed, that those were not rationally justifiable. Okay, that is technically true, but we do prefer to be healthy rather than sick and comfortable rather than in pain. Once you grant that, as a, call me foolish, call me irrational. I'd really rather not be sick. I'd really rather not be hungry. Once you grant that, a lot follows. Namely, that once you add in one other assumption, namely, we are social creatures and our well-being depends on the actions of others. So you can hurt me and I can hurt you. Now, as long as I am pursuing my own well-being and I'm prevailing on you not to hurt me, or to help me. If I'm drowning, will you please extend a branch to pull me out? Please don't step on me on the way to the water on the beach. Well, then you really are committed to it being symmetrical. Namely, if I'm prevailing on you not to harm me and to help me, I've got to be committed to help you and not to harm you, or else you won't take me seriously. And from that, you get the basis of morality, namely the interchangeability of perspectives, the irrelevance of someone's own parochial interests. And you get things like the golden rule, the categorical imperative, the veil of ignorance, the view from nowhere, all ways of saying that as soon as we realize that the difference between me and you has no logical weight, then we get morality from self-interest and from sociality.
Thank you. Let me invite Gregory Hopper, Monte McMurky, and Matt Moskal to give us 3 questions, Stephen. Let's answer them together if you can. Please, Gregor Hopper.
Okay, thank you. My question is just what do we do about this practically? You spend a lot of time in the book really talking about how probabilistic reasoning and hypothesis testing, game theory, et cetera, is useful. But do you think then that should be part of the curriculum? Should people really be forced to study that? Is that something that they should learn?
Thank you. Monte McMurky, please.
Okay, greetings. Fascinating conversation. Where would you place judgment in your discussion? Because judgment, I believe, is almost a form of adumbration of all that which you have alluded to in your most compelling conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, for this round, Matt Moskal.
Professor Pinker, thank you for being here. I just got to say really quickly that poppycock is my new favorite word. Thank you. Thank you for rationality. Thank you for enlightenment. Now they've been a positive impact on my life. I'm not an academic, and I'm wondering how humor fits into reasonability and rationality.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to answer them quickly. Should the tools of reasoning be part of the curriculum? I think they should, including probability and logic and correlation versus causation, maybe even game theory and statistical decision theory. The inevitable question is, what are you going to take out of the curriculum to make room for them? And my one answer is trigonometry. I have nothing against trigonometry. I love trigonometry, but there are only so many hours in the day. And that's the kind of decision where you might choose to revamp a curriculum inherited from the medieval trivium and quadrivium and say, well, they didn't have probability theory in medieval times. We have it now. Of the two, it's the more important branch of mathematics, and so on with critical thinking. And it's the reason I think it deserves priority in the curriculum is that, like reading and writing, it is fundamental to everything else. You can't really understand politics and history and social studies and civics unless you can avoid flaws of reasoning, like affirming the consequent, like arguing ad hominem, arguing from authority, confusing correlation and causation, reasoning from anecdote. If you don't know that these are fallacies, you'll commit fallacies in everything else. So yes, judgment, judgment can be thought of, as opposed to logic, as perhaps weighing lots of considerations, each one of which increments or decrements your credence in a hypothesis a little bit at a time. So it does go into more probabilistic forms of reasoning, such as Bayesian reasoning. And when there are enough of these considerations, if there are dozens or scores or hundreds or thousands of them, that's kind of what goes into deep learning algorithms now, the big data. And some of the intelligence in artificial intelligence, as limited as it is, may be a form of simulating what goes into human judgment. In which one other comment it might be pertinent, which is that in studies, one of the most robust findings in psychology is that we're apt to overestimate the accuracy of human judgment. That when you compare the judgment of an expert on some quantifiable outcome, such as a disease, skipping bail, a psychiatric diagnosis, compare it to a simple formula. And I'm not talking about a fancy schmancy AI algorithm, but even just adding up a bunch of predictors and weighting them. The formula usually does better than the human judge. It's called actuarial versus clinical decision making, and human judgment is something that we should itself view skeptically. Finally, humor. Yes, I do think that humor can often expose an aspect of reasoning that we take for granted, but that can lead to paradox or absurdity. And I make use of a lot of jokes in the book. I have a discussion of humor in a previous book, How the Mind Works. I have a chapter called What's So Funny, to try to show why is it that often humor can kind of point to some absurdity that it often takes a long time to figure out why it's absurd. Jewish humor in particular, but other forms as well. And humor and rationality are, I think, intimately linked, at least verbal humor. Slapstick, maybe not.
And finally, to conclude this fascinating conversation, we have the questions of Luke Hallam, Michael Cookson, and Alex Caro, please. Luke.
Professor Pinker, thank you so much for being here. My question is quite simple. Facebook has been in the news a lot recently. It seems to me that social media companies amplify a lot of the biases and individual reasoning that you've been talking about. Do you think this is the case? And if so, what needs to be done about it?
Yeah,
Okay,
I think.
Let me give the option to the other two questioners. Michael Coxon and Alex Caro, please. Michael Coxon.
Hey, Steve, big fan, but I'll make this really quick. In the book, you mentioned about the financial advisors who made predictions for 8 years, and then they sent their they sent advertisements to people at the end. And I recently heard from so I have a chat group with a group of friends, and somebody talked about how there's 5 right-wing radio hosts who died from COVID. And he thought that maybe there's a lot of conservatives who are going to think twice. But reading your book at the same time, I immediately thought of all the right-wing radio hosts who did not die, right? And thought about, and especially with the statistics with this particular disease, where you know, it's kind of a mind thing where a lot of people. I mean, I know a lot of people who have had a rough go of it or died, but a lot of people don't have a lot of symptoms and things like that. There's plenty of people who it seems like there's plenty of people left over who are then able to kind of go on and tell everybody there's nothing to worry about. And I'm just kind of wondering about that. Is it seems like the same kind of problem, right? Is that there's a lot of these. So what about all the right-wing radio hosts who live on and tell everybody that there's nothing to worry about, and nobody's going to think about those 5 that died?
Thank you very much. Alex Caro, please.
Hi, Professor Pinker. My question is about the Enlightenment. So way back in the 18th and 19th centuries, we had strong Enlightenment movements that changed the world, such as the American Revolution, the cult of reason in France, and the positivist temples in Brazil. We've obviously made a lot of scientific and social progress since that time, but I'm wondering, why does it feel like Enlightenment sentiment is atrophied over time nonetheless?
Yeah. Did you say on the left, or did you just say in general? I'm sorry, just to clarify.
And less. Sorry, not on the left.
Okay.
Overall, yeah.
Just want to. Yeah. Okay. So Facebook. I think there is there is a tendency now to blame every social ill on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, and I think they do can play a negative role. Jonathan Rauch in The Constitution of Knowledge shows how the rules of engagement in social media are almost the opposite of the institutions that have tried to make up for human cognitive biases by socially shared norms of fact-checking and vetting and deliberation, by encouraging instant reactions and reputations to be gathered by shareability and notoriety rather than accuracy. Facebook seems to have all of the opposite incentives of science, responsible journalism, and liberal democracy. So I think there is something that is built in, but in understanding why we do have outbursts of irrationality, such as the conspiracy theory of stealing the election, we have to look at other media, at right-wing cable network news, at AM talk radio, at residential segregation that have left-wing people in urban educated enclaves and right-wing people more in exurbs and rural areas. We can't make social media the only culprit in the polarization that's facing us now. In terms of the right-wing radio hosts who die of COVID, and I know people, I'm not going to confess anything about myself, who had a certain amount of schadenfreude when that happened, perhaps who saw it as a talking point or almost a dirty trick in persuading people that avoiding vaccinations is foolish. If those radio hosts were the only evidence that vaccines were effective, then yes, it would be no better than the scam of the financial advisor who sends out every possible forecast and then zeroes in on the people who happen in retrospect to get the accurate ones. But of course, the case for vaccines does not consist of those radio hosts. It's big randomized controlled trials, and that's where the emphasis should be. There is a moral question that, given that people are swayed by anecdotes because of the availability heuristic, is it moral to capitalize on those examples if they happen to be aligned with what the data suggest? It's a little bit like the question of, if you want to raise awareness of climate change, should you have saturation coverage of the wildfires and hurricanes, even knowing that you can't really pin any hurricane by itself on climate change, but as long as people are influenced by those images, why not stoke it with images that happen to also make the scientifically valid point? Anyway, I don't know what the answer is, whether that's just justifiable rhetoric. Perhaps if it's accompanied by the facts, by the data, then, and it's a for example, then it can be a justifiable tactic of persuasion. In terms of the Enlightenment didn't last for very long before it was faced with a counter-Enlightenment. Back in the 19th century, Romanticism, nationalism, romantic militarism, emotivism. And I think that the two have been really in tension ever since. And some of the all-star intellectuals of the university curriculum and of the educated critical open forums have been of detractors of the Enlightenment, Nietzsche and Heidegger and Schopenhauer and Sartre and the Frankfurt School. So the Enlightenment has never been that much of a crowd pleaser. I think it is kind of the underlying philosophy behind a lot of our institutions, like liberal democracy, like science, like organizations for international cooperation, but it's always faced an opposition. Probably because, I would say, as a fan of the Enlightenment, because counter-Enlightenment romanticism does speak to certain enduring human impulses, like revering a strong leader, like loyalty to the tribe, like feelings of essentialism, that health comes from holistic naturalness merged with a people rooted to a land. And the Enlightenment has always had to push back against those features of human nature, which will not go away, which is why I think the case for Enlightenment values perennially has to be made.
And so with this, we conclude this fantastic conversation. I want to read one of the last paragraphs of the book. Professor Pinker says, the power of rationality to guide moral progress is of a piece with its power to guide material progress and wise choices in our lives. So that's a wonderful way of recapping this very rich conversation. Thank you all for having joined us. Thank you very much, Professor Steven Pinker. And thank you for being with us, for giving us this wonderful book, Rationality, what it is, what it seems scarce, and why it matters. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Moisés. Thank you, Persuasion.
Thanks very much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.